Welcome to our podcast series, Raising Saints and Forming Scholars, where we delve into your questions about the world of classical education. We were made for truth, beauty, and goodness. Let's talk about it. What does Socrates' dialogue Phaedrus on love tell us about students in classical education? How is the classical method different from modern pedagogy? Does one have a certain gravitas? Why study Latin? What does a classical high school look like? Find out this and many other interesting things about the liberal arts by listening to my interview with Headmaster Jonathan Winn from Oak Grove Classical Academy here in Albuquerque. You won't be disappointed you took the time. Well, hello there and welcome. I am happy to introduce to you Jonathan Winn from Oak Grove Classical Academy. And I'll just begin this by saying back in 2019, our school was at Sandia for, it was an event where we had different booths for schools. And this is actually when I met Jonathan. And I remember telling myself, we are going to touch base again for Holy Child Catholic School. And I don't know if I'm the only one here, but as the year ended in 2019, I wrote that down. That was my dream for the next year. And then COVID happened. But I have not forgotten. And here we are years later. And we are so blessed to have Jonathan Winn here, who's going to share some thoughts with us about classical education. So I think first, Jonathan, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your school? And
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Principal Martinez, for welcoming you here. It's wonderful to speak to administrators that have the same heart for classical education and the same vision. So Oak Grove Classical Academy was founded in 2008. Okay. In Albuquerque.
We started in 2008 too.
Did you really?
Yeah,
wow.
Interesting. Yeah.
A lot of good things happened then too that year. And it was really founded by just several moms and dads that were getting together and were looking at the educational and cultural landscape in Albuquerque at that time. Okay. And really they had young children that were kindergarten to first or second grade age. And they just wanted something different, and they were looking for a Christ-centered education. That was first and foremost for them. They wanted an education that would help their children know who Jesus is and and understand a biblical worldview for life. But they also wanted an education that was rigorous and holistic in terms of cultivating wisdom and virtue, and even looking at some of the Christian school curriculums. And a lot of these parents actually grew up in Christian schools, and they while there were some many beautiful things and great things that they learned in their walk with Christ, academically they felt like there was something missing at times.
I understand.
They couldn't quite put their finger on what that was. Yes. So they began to think about that, and then also these parents they wanted to be very involved in the education of their children, and they didn't feel like they were full-time homeschool moms, but they did feel that God had called them to be an integral part of their child's formation, spiritually as well as intellectually. And so they came across what's called the university model. It's a model that was started by a school in Texas. Grace Prep Academy is still there. Okay. It's, I think, near Dallas, Texas. And in 1996, they started what's called the University Model. And essentially, it is a model that pulls together the strengths of the traditional classroom, 5 days a week, with the traditional homeschool model. So bringing those together, our students, the way that looks very briefly, I'll just say, we share time with the parents in instruction. So there's 5 school days a week, but there are home days and there are campus days. We provide all the curriculum, all the assessment, most of the instruction, but the kids have time. Their parents are co-teachers, and so they're on campus part-time and they're at home part-time. And that's really one of the most unique features about Oak Grove in Albuquerque, is that we are Christ-centered, classical, and we have this university model all in one place. So.
Wow. You know what? That's so inspiring to listen to. It's so funny. In 2008, I was teaching at St. Pius. I loved it there, but I left and really felt like I needed to do exactly what you know, working with homeschoolers, doing the classical method. And I know I had nothing to do with it, but this school started in 2008 as well. Oh. So I think if you look at the big picture, you can just see what the Holy Spirit's doing.
That's right.
How important it is to really go back to our roots in Christian education and look at the classical method. That's beautiful.
Yes.
I was hoping we could discuss, maybe just in your own life, why you feel drawn yourself to the classical method. Your story.
Yeah, good question. When I think of this question, I actually go back to 2008. Believe it or not, wow. That date keeps coming up.
Yes.
So at that time, I was a high school teacher, high school Bible teacher in China, working
wow.
at an overseas international school there. And my mother-in-law sends me an email. She says, "Jonathan, I'm really curious about this new school that's starting in Albuquerque, and I'd love to get your input on it because I was studying for my master's in education at the time. So I'm learning a lot about educational models." And so she started sharing with me about Oak Grove.
Oh, wow.
and that was my introduction to the concept of classical education,
wow.
as well as the university model. And so that's where the curiosity began. And I've been teaching at that point almost 10 years.
Okay.
And, I learned a lot as a teacher and even going through this master's program, but I had not come across the classical model. And so that's kind of where the seed was planted. And then a friend of mine who I also worked with while I was in China, he gave me a book called Repairing the Ruins by Douglas Wilson.
I have not read that.
Douglas Wilson, Douglas Wilson, he is one of the kind of the leaders in the renewal of the classical education movement, or at least the Christian classical education movement in the United States.
Okay.
I want to say he wrote this book probably in the early 90s or late 80s,
okay.
maybe even. And so as I was reading that book, I mean, even just the concept, repairing the ruins, really, it was Douglas Wilson kind of looking at the landscape of education in the United States and saying, what happened? What has brought us to this point where we see so much breakdown and apathy and cynicism and complacency? And so he began to do his own research historically. How do we had such a strong educational foundation in America?
Yes.
Where did that come from? What did that look like? And how did we get here? So as I read that book, that furthered my understanding and kind of my curiosity about what was missing in education, in contemporary education today. And so moved back to the United States, came to New Mexico in 2013, and that seed was kind of back in the back of my mind, but I worked at a few different schools locally in Albuquerque, still trying to grow as an educator, and then the board of Oak Grove approached me about the headmaster position.
Wow.
And I realized if I'm going to apply for this position, I need to really study classical education.
Right.
If I'm going to be considered for this job, and
yes.
of course if I want to do a good job. So I really officially began to really read more broadly about classical education at that time.
Okay.
And the more you probably had this experience, and I know a lot of our families had this experience, and teachers that come to us, that the more you read about classical education, there's something that just rings true deep
Absolutely.
in my heart,
yes.
that this is what we have been missing. Oh. This is what we've lost in Western society today. And honestly, I believe that the classical education model really honors God's design, that we were made in His image, and really reinforces and just elevates that.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. I taught elementary school, middle school, and high school at the Archdiocese, and after about 15 years, just like you, I just felt something is wrong. I had felt that way for so long, and when I looked into the classical, like you, I knew in my heart, like, this is the only way. And it's not easy, but it's the only way I think we're going to help save our students and help renew education for real, in a real way. And so I can definitely identify with what you're saying. Wow.
Yeah. It's been quite a journey, and I have so much more still to learn.
That's how I feel.
I'm constantly listening to podcasts.
Yes.
Where they talk like us.
Yes.
I love to hear how different classical writers and thinkers articulate and explain and go through the history, and also just thinking through what does classical education mean in 21st century United States.
And
right?
I do think that's interesting too. I started the master's program at classical education at the University of Dallas.
Yes, I've heard really good things about that program.
I've learned so much, but I think what makes me think of what you're saying is people in my class are from around the world.
Yeah.
And they're delving into the classical, and they're talking about the same things that you are, and they're asking the same questions. How do we do this in the 21st century? How do we do it in America right now, right here? And obviously we have our roots that go back thousands of years, but we also have technology. We also have ways that we have to work with young people right now, meeting them where they are.
That's right.
So I have those same kind of questions, which was kind of making me wonder. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was about this day and age. Sometimes people say if you're studying the classical, you're not ready in terms of technical skills, or I have certain ideas, but I would love to hear how you feel about that and what you tell your students and your families.
That's great. I actually think of a metaphor that Socrates came up with. So Socrates came up with a metaphor really based on Plato's Phaedrus, and it's in Socrates' metaphor. He has an extended metaphor where he talks about this image of two horses drawing a chariot. Okay, and the horses, there's a black horse and a white horse, I think, and they kind of represent the different passions of the human soul.
Yes.
And the chariot is the intellect and the mind. And I'm sure your audience has heard of put the cart before the horse.
Yes.
That metaphor. Well, I think it actually rings true a little bit with this question. A focus on the technical skills as primary or as a focus, I think, is putting the cart before the horse. I think because classical education, the aim is to cultivate wisdom and virtue. It's cultivating the kind of person that you are growing to be. It's more focused on who the child is than what they do.
Right.
Because who they are and what is in their heart is what is going to drive how they go about what they do in work.
Absolutely.
And so if the focus is technical skills before the formation of character and the mind, you're going to get what so Teddy Roosevelt, he once said, if you educate a man in mind but not in morals, you're creating a menace to society.
Wow.
C.S. Lewis, and you guys love him, I'm sure.
Yes.
He once said, education, as useful as it is, if it doesn't include moral instruction, only makes better devils. So
that's perfect.
You have a lot of people that are smart, but if they're not wise, they're dangerous, actually.
I think we're living through that.
Yeah, so I would say to just continue that, in terms of technical skills, there's absolutely, students need to learn technical skills. But is that the most important thing they need to learn? Is that the primary thing they need to learn? Is that what we should be focusing their passions towards? I would say no. I would say, because in classical education, a big idea also is ordering the affections. Ordering what is most important, what is second important, what is third, and so what is most important is wisdom. Forming a person of wisdom and virtue, and then that's going to affect how they engage in those technical skills. And we're employers too. You think about who you hire, and this is true for any employer, not just a school.
Right.
But yes, we want capable people, but more important than capability is character.
Yes.
If I have a capable teacher who is arrogant and self-centered, that's just a bomb waiting to go off. That's a disaster waiting to happen. The same is true in in a research lab, in medicine and law. I mean, you pick any career. Capabilities over character. Character's first, then comes capability. And so there's a time and place to learn technical skills, but there's also, that's not the most important thing.
Right.
And so that's my short answer.
Sure.
If that helps.
And how do the families at your school respond to that?
Yeah. Back to what we were saying earlier about we're in the 21st century, right? So we do have to consider, originally, as I understand classical education, education, well, it used to be spelled education, right? Not just not classical.
Right,
we make that distinction now.
Yes.
But up until, as I understand, the mid-1800s, school was about, again, forming the mind.
Yes.
Forming character, a transfer of culture and traditions, learning the wisdom of the ages, and then a child would do an apprenticeship to learn skills. You have the liberal arts, then you have the common arts.
Yes.
Right. So the liberal arts: grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. 7. And then the common arts are things like blacksmith and cooking and all the different technical things, and of course technology's advanced, but that was something they did outside of the school. And I'm still learning about the history of education in America, but I know there was a shift around the end of the 1800s and 1900s. John Dewey.
Yes.
And so the focus shifted to a more utilitarian, pragmatic, let's prepare a workforce versus let's cultivate human beings and our future citizens. And so that shift, the whole apprenticeship model kind of faded away with that in many ways. And school became more about let's give them the skills they need to get a job. And then, of course, because of time and limitations, that focus then the other academic things that were there, those beautiful things that were forming minds and hearts, over the years, more and more just been let go of. And so...
Yes. Yeah, I'm very happy to hear you say that, because I myself, when I had to go back to school and get degrees in education to be a teacher,
sure.
and then to get a principal's certificate, and I have found that what you're discussing is exactly what happened. We had so many theories about productivity and utilitarianism. We never spent any time talking about the type of person that we want the students to be, and what we want to pass on down to them from Western civilization. We never talked about that, so there was always definitely something wrong in my mind in how I was led in that area. So I'm happy to hear you say that, because it's not easy, but it's so important. And just the more we can get the word out that we're doing things differently than the modern pedagogical method.
Right.
So, and I'm glad when you mentioned the word classical. This is something that's always important to remember. I try to tell everybody was classical. Everybody learned the classical way until, as you mentioned, things started to shift in the 19th century. Then you had the 2 world wars, and we completely lost any faith in what we were doing, and we really stepped into the John Dewey model. And so I'm just really trying to spread the word how the modern pedagogical method, which we use in the Catholic Church and some churches, isn't really working for our students. Is we're not winning the battle. We're not only are they not learning, I don't think they're filled with joy about who they are as a person. So would you want to share other ways that the modern pedagogical method is not giving us the full vision of the human person, like you were just talking about?
We talked with our parents a lot about the differences between a contemporary educational model or a quote unquote, I say progressive model, which if you read the speeches and the writings of our founding fathers and you look at their level of vocabulary and their eloquence, it's hard to make a case that we've progressed a lot, at least in academically. Certainly there are some ideas like slavery that have been great changes that we have made in our country. But the classical model I think one of the big differences, one of the critiques sometimes people say is that it's not child-centered. When I was learning about education, we talk about like the child-centered classroom, and of course, like, who wants to argue that? Who wants to argue that the focus is
we wouldn't be here
on the students, on the care for the students, but what is best for the students? When I have 3 children, and sometimes when I am handling them in a disciplinary manner, I'll say, okay, who do you want me to address right now? Do you want me to address the 12-year-old, or do you want me to treat you like an adult? And they will always say, treat me like the adult. Kids want to be treated like an adult.
Yes.
And I think that is part of God's design. Mm-hmm. God designed us to have a desire to be respected, to be mature, to have responsibility, and to be independent thinkers. And so the classical model, typically, it's a more strict classroom. Yes. There are higher expectations.
Yes.
And the reason for that, though, I think this is a misconception. The reason for that is not because we're trying to have this like elitist air about us.
There is a misconception about that.
It's not a prideful thing. There is a gravitas. There is a weight, a seriousness about what we're doing here.
Yes.
This isn't a joke. This isn't just passing a test and getting along. We are trying to form you into a mature adult.
Yes.
So you were teaching to the adult in the child. So instead of dropping down to the level and everything's kind of informal and just fun and we just play, and I think there's a place for play, but I think actually play is more rich when there's also a seriousness to the whole education process. So I think the classical model, it is more adult-oriented than child-oriented.
The text
certainly is, and even just what we are expecting of our children and calling them to maturity, and say, who do you want to be? Like, let's start living out who we want to become.
Yes.
Because you become what you behold and what you do.
Yes.
So those habits of heart and mind are very important. I think also, and we touched on this earlier, but classical education is not vocational training. It's moral training. The vocational part certainly comes later, and I think you and I, you ask any professor. Ask professors, what kind of students do you want to have in your classroom? Would you prefer a student from a classical school, or just a regular, average public or private school in the United States? And I would almost put a lot of money on,
absolutely,
or as much as I have, on them saying we would prefer a classical school. And I believe it's because they know, they see the difference. They see the difference, and I've heard the difference from our alumni when they go to colleges, and they are very well equipped to engage deeply and have discussions, and they're respectful, and they're ready for that vocational training at that point because they've had the solid foundation. They've put the horses before the cart.
Yes. Absolutely. You know what? I hear from students almost every month from a long time ago or just recently saying, thank you for that rigor, because now I can function in college or past college because I had that rigor. So that's absolutely true what you're saying. Now, you mentioned beholding.
Mm-hmm.
At our school, we've really tried to put beautiful artworks in our hallway. And so
that's great. I love it. I saw them walking in here.
So we really, can you talk a little bit about beholding and beauty, and also truth and goodness? Truth, beauty, and goodness. How you see that in your school?
Yeah. So I like how Andrew Kern, he says, classical education is about cultivating wisdom and virtue by nourishing the mind and heart with truth, beauty, and goodness. Yes. Now, at Oak Grove, so the way that we try to nourish the child, obviously, just like that, that metaphor of nourishing, like, you're giving like a diet. It's like, what are you feeding them?
Yes.
And so we definitely want our children and have our children reading classical literature. It's timeless literature that stimulates their mind and their imaginations to think about true good and beautiful characters and history and stories and what is noble, what is, what are virtues, what are vices. As far as artwork, I would say that's one area that we are not as good at.
Okay.
Partly because we don't have our own campus.
Oh, I see.
So we can't just decorate everything the way we'd like. We are actually hoping to get our own campus in a few years.
Wow.
But that's definitely one thing that, teachers will put pictures on their walls. We do have projectors in our classroom so that we can show them, wonderful art and just get the students discussing, what do you see here? How does it what do you feel in your soul when you behold this? And also I mentioned about our university model that we have students on home days. So we're also encouraging parents. Fridays especially are a day that is more for enrichment learning in the grammar school. Okay. So we encourage them, hey, go to the library, go to museums, go for walks in nature.
Yes.
Slow down.
Yes.
Take a plant and just gaze at it for a while.
Oh, we love to say that also, that gazing. Yes.
So those are some ways that we do that. We're certainly, I think we could still use some more focus on beauty in terms of art in particular. But also, we have fine arts, music. I think that's one of the reasons why it's one of the traditional arts, is music has a way of tuning the soul and just helping you be more sensitive and aware of details of things and just, I don't know, we all know music is healing for the soul.
Absolutely. Classical
or not, that's in our human psyche.
Yes,
so.
Yes. You had mentioned earlier when we spoke about some of the classes you teach at your school. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us about the classes you teach?
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
I'd love to. I think as we were chatting earlier, I was talking about being a headmaster, being an administrator. One of the hardest things for me was transitioning out of the classroom, because that's really where
all the
my
fun
heart is, where the fun is.
Yes.
And I love teaching and I love the time with the kids. So, last year I got to teach a class in rhetoric, which was
wonderful.
I'd taught courses in communication before in different school settings, but like I was saying earlier, being able to actually read some of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and some of these writers on the roots of rhetoric, and not just focusing on the skill, but focusing really, again,
what grade was this?
10th grade.
10th grade rhetoric.
Yes. So we have in our rhetoric school, 9th grade studies material logic.
Wonderful. And
then we have 10th grade and 11th grade are rhetoric 1 and 2, respectively. And then 12th grade is senior thesis.
Wonderful.
And so we study classic as well as even contemporary works of rhetoric. Okay. Guys like Martin Luther King Jr. and some great speeches by some presidents. So we study what does excellent rhetoric have in common? What are the common traits? So I really enjoyed that. We did a whole lot of different exercises and projects. And then this year I am teaching the seniors what class in biblical leadership. We have a whole trajectory called biblical leadership that starts in 6th grade.
Okay.
And it has a very much like an apologetics, philosophy, topics of Christian living kind of focus. So because our seniors are getting ready to go into college, most of them, if not all of them, we want to prepare them for the various worldviews they'll encounter and being able to be discerning of where these worldviews come from. Yes. How can you identify them? How are they different from the Christian worldview? And really how to engage classmates and professors when they're kind of operating in a post-Christian society in many ways. So it's preparing them for that.
That's wonderful. At our school in 7th, 8th grade, we do just a very basic introduction to philosophical studies.
That's great.
And I'm always telling the students, if you go to a classical high school, you're going to encounter rhetoric and this and that. So it's nice to know someone is actually doing it. And, I could definitely tell them about that, because I just think when you have the full picture of what we're trying to do here and what you're doing in your high school, it's something really beautiful to offer to young people.
Thank you. We're so glad that we can offer a rhetoric school, and that was
wonderful.
As Oak Grove has grown, that was one of the most difficult aspects of that growth process, because we're competing with schools that had all the programs and all the activities and this and that, and we had some just faithful families that were committed to the vision of classical education, and as we've grown, we've been able to have some of those activities and sports and all that in the proper order of importance and context. Not sports doesn't become like the main thing at our school. Right. We want to keep that as a service to athletics or academics and the formation of character. But I'm just so thankful that we have a rhetoric school, and that it's been growing as it has. We're about 90 students now, and in the rhetoric school, and that's just been such a blessing.
What a blessing, yeah.
And senior thesis, I just have to say, if any of your families want to come for senior thesis, it's an open event to the public.
Is it?
Our students, the way the course works, they choose a topic for research. They do extensive research on the topic. They write a research paper in the classical arrangement, and then they memorize it.
Wow.
And that's what really sets it apart, because I've worked at high schools for many years. They have capstone projects. They have different things like that.
Same here, yeah.
But our students,
this is the classical way, because we are working on memorization since preschool.
They are mastering. They're mastering their subject.
Wow.
And this, it's like the scripture talks about the student who becomes like their teacher.
Yes.
And that's our prayer. Our school vision is learn for life, live for Christ, and that when our students graduate, they love learning. They're a lifelong learner. They have those habits instilled already, and they want to live for Christ. And when they get up there and they speak from memory, a research for 20 minutes.
That's wonderful.
It's incredible.
So when is this day?
May 6th is actually May 5th. I'm sorry, we just changed the date to the 5th.
Yeah.
But May 5th, 6 p.m. At Oak Grove.
Okay.
Which meets at Hoffmantown Church. And so that May 5th is when we have our finalists for senior thesis. So as the school has grown, and you've got 20-minute presentations, so we don't have time for all 12 of our graduates to do it all in one night. So we have like a round one where they all present, they're evaluated, and then we choose the top 3 for the final night. They actually compete for a scholarship, the highest ones, and that's what's on May 5th. So
oh my goodness, I just think that's so important, because like when we do the memorization so young, I think it'd be great for people to see kind of that final product in that whole span.
Yes.
Wow.
It's very encouraging.
I think the last question I wanted to ask you, because I'm sure you hear this a lot as I do, what do you think are common misconceptions about classical education?
Yeah.
If we could just take some time to clear some of that up.
Yeah. I think one of them is that it's irrelevant. For example, like the study of Latin.
Right.
You hear Latin's a dead language.
Right.
Why study Latin? And I understand where people are coming from with that, because they are thinking of studying Latin like they're thinking of studying Spanish or Chinese or French.
Right.
Like you learn those languages for interpersonal communication skills. I learned Chinese when I was in China. I studied Spanish in high school because I wanted to travel to South America. So, but you don't study Latin for those reasons. You study, Latin. I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but for your audience, I'll share. It is really because of its historical roots, the foundation of English, and I tell our families, it's like it's so strategic to study Latin. Like Latin has never actually died. In fact, Latin may be the immortal language. A lot of languages kind of come and fade and change a lot. Latin's kind of set, it's embedded, it's like preserved in English, French, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese, like it's embedded there. And it's actually incredibly practical.
Yes.
Because when a student studies one Latin word, they're simultaneously learning the root of maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 other words across languages. So our founding fathers, they weren't they weren't stupid about
Right.
about curriculum.
Right.
You know, there was a reason why that was. They knew what they were going for, but I think it's because the shift in education is focused to this totally pragmatic, totally utilitarian approach. That classical education, it seems irrelevant from the outside, but if you give it time, if you give time for that child to develop and grow, and then you have your graduates, you have your seniors, you have them going out in the workforce, all of a sudden you realize this is the most relevant thing in the world. So that's one, irrelevant. I think another is that it's very Eurocentric.
Right.
Right, and of course, in our
Yes.
contemporary culture, there's a lot of concerns and criticisms about, who wrote these books, where are they coming from, what are their perspectives, and I always say, well, we are just trying to choose the ideas and the thoughts that have been recorded that have shaped the very best of Western society,
Right.
irrespective of whether they're a man or a woman, whether they're European or African or whatever. We are looking at, these are the great works that have shaped our culture and that have stimulated thought and ideas and contemplated the human spirit, and so they are worthy of study. Now, let me also say, I spent years in China. And China has also a very rich, long history. And there are classical educators that are researching the classical tradition in Chinese culture.
Right, I've seen that. Mm-hmm.
Have you come across that? Redeeming the Six Arts? That's the name of the book I've been looking at.
I haven't looked at that book, but I do know Jessica Houghton-Wilson.
Yeah.
She has mentioned that a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. And so we're certainly not, we don't choose an author based on, are they a man or a woman, or were they from Europe? We are looking at which works have had the greatest impact on human culture and thought. And we choose a lot of works that are, a lot of these books are not even written by Christians. Right. They're written by pagan thinkers. Mm-hmm. They are operating on what we call common grace, general revelation, wisdom that God gives common man about the human condition even, and human nature. And so they are worthy of study. And then, of course, we analyze them, we break them down, we compare to biblical worldview. And I believe that a classical education actually is what honors cultures and honors the human dignity of a man and a woman and different races better than any other educational approach.
Right.
So yeah, I don't think we're Eurocentric. I think historically, sure, a lot of those works came from Europe because of the way history worked with the Roman Empire and the Greeks and the church and how that spread. But there are also great writers in other cultures that we certainly look at and consider.
Well, you're making me think of the words of Pope Benedict XVI, who recently passed away, and he wrote a lot about what you're talking about and mentioned we're not in control of how Christ chose to enter the world, and he happened to come during a Greco-Roman civilization. Right. And he said we have to look at that as providential. It's just how it happened.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we're elitist, like you said.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've seen this when you study those authors, in particular those pagan authors. They give a vision of the human person, and maybe we haven't always lived up to it as a civilization. We're seeing that now. You mentioned slavery. But at least there is an ideal that you want to live, that you're moving towards, And I think, speaking for myself, that's so valuable with all of these authors. We haven't always lived up to it as a society or as an individual, but it's something to work towards. I don't think you're ever going to find something more inspiring.
Well, and even guys like Frederick Douglass. What is it that he was reading and studying that liberated his mind and soul? It was the classical writers. It was not that he was like, only reading, African writers or African American writers, although there are definitely some of those as well. And there's actually been some good research into that tradition. But he was reading, these classic books, and that is what has there's a reason why they're called the liberal arts.
Yes.
They liberate.
Yes.
They liberate the mind and soul from being enslaved or oppressed by whether it's a ruling monarch or the current contemporary way of thinking. That's forgetting, ignoring the past, and just saying what is current is what is most important. And back to C.S. Lewis, he said, anything that is not eternal is eternally out of date. So, we got to study that which has been demonstrated to be timeless and has lasted and has impacted society. And I think for anyone, if you let that be the criteria for what you read, you will not have regrets. And it will make you a human being that is more wise and more compassionate and more humble and discerning, and that's what we need more and more of. So
absolutely. Wow. Well, this is certainly a lot of food for thought. I'm going to really think about those C.S. Lewis quotes. And maybe we'll have you come back and just do a C.S. Lewis podcast.
That'd be wonderful. Yeah.
But wow, this is just wonderful. It's just so good to hear you speak about all of these things that we aspire to here at Holy Child.
Yeah, well, praise God. It's my privilege to serve in a school like Oak Grove and to get to meet you guys here and maybe we partner in different ways, just sharing that vision for our state here and beyond. There are classical Christian schools all over the country, and more are starting as more and more people are kind of waking up to what's happened in our with education and in our society, and wanting to go back home.
Yeah, I agree.
C.S. Lewis often talks yes. about. I'm not a C.S. Lewis expert, by the way, but I do love reading his stuff.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you, Jonathan Winn. Thank you for spending time with us, and thank you for joining us on our Raising Saints, Forming Scholars podcast. We like to highlight our very own students here at Holy Child Catholic School. At Holy Child, our students study Latin from kindergarten all the way up to 8th grade, and it is a study of the language from the roots up. Let's take a look at one of our students who can recite the Hail Mary in Latin. As Catholics, we know Latin is the official language of the Church, and it is one of our great joys to pray in our mother tongue.
The Hail Mary in Latin. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, et benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen.